Now, today's hero, Daniel, started to serve in the government of Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of the king of Babylon, slightly more than 600 years before Jesus. The kingdom took in what is today modern Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and then Israel. So quite a hefty chunk of land. He invaded Israel 3 times, and the last time he invaded, he took them all captive because he eventually got tired of them. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for more than 40 years, during which time Daniel served in key positions in government. So the question comes today, why did I choose Daniel? And I'm not going to be spending much time talking about Daniel and the lion's den, but today I chose him because I'm aware of many Salvationists and Christians who work in public service. Example, teachers, medical professions, first responders, and many other essential services that are either funded by municipal, provincial, or federal government. Most of them remain fulfilled doing good work at the ground level, doing what they were thinking they would do when they signed up for that work. But then there are those who find themselves in highly responsible or accountable positions, senior managers and CEOs of hospitals, police commissioners, fire chiefs, a general in the Canadian Armed Forces. Some Salvationists even get elected to government. Walter Dinsdale from Brandon was an elected representative and a former minister of cabinet. Now, when we were in Zimbabwe, a Salvationist, Joyce Mujuru, she was the wife of one of Robert Mugabe's generals. And she was appointed by Robert Mugabe, the president at the time, to be the vice president of the country. So there's Mugabe, and then there's this Salvationist woman, Joyce Mujuru. When her appointment was announced, the media descended upon her community. Now, in order to get an interview, they had to interrupt her timbrel rehearsal at the Salvation Army. So they knocked on the door, and she came out wearing her full uniform and carrying her tambourine as she was interviewed by the press in her first interview on television as the new vice president of Zimbabwe. So Daniel is a hero to me because he proved that God's people can work at that level and still maintain their integrity as Christians if they so choose. Well, first of all, how was Daniel and his companions? If you didn't recognize those names, by the way, it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the alternates, which you may remember from Sunday school. Well, Daniel and his companions were prepared, first of all, by their heritage. They were Jewish, and they were taken away from their home by Nebuchadnezzar during one of the earlier invasions. So within this, he was given a moral and an ethical framework in which to work, which would become important later in his life. Now, when we are grounded in who we were made to be by God, we remain that person, no matter where we find ourselves. And then secondly, essentially, these 3 companions were chosen for their brains and their beauty. Because they were handsome and because they were intelligent. And we read that earlier on in the scripture. They then received professional qualifications, we read as well. Essentially, they got a bachelor's degree in public administration, and they graduated at the top of their class. Now, this is an important point because Jesus reiterated the great commandment when he said, "Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind." And quite often we forget that portion. We sometimes think that we have to leave our minds in the locker when we come to church on Sunday, that we don't bring our intelligence with us. But that's not what the law says, and that's not what Jesus said. He said, love the Lord with all thy mind. Paul advised Timothy, study to show thyself approved unto God, a worker that needs not to be ashamed. So this was Timothy's advice to another youth, to be sure that you study to show yourself approved unto God, a worker that needeth not to be ashamed. So study is important. God never intended us to leave our brains in the locker, regardless of where we work. But also he had healthy habits. And if you're going to be in leadership in any position, it takes energy and stamina. It's interesting that even the diet that the four companions chose was even more strict than what the Jewish law provided. As long as it was kosher, didn't have pork, didn't have the kind of animal, eat the animals, and that the food was prepared in a special way. But no, they said vegetables only. So in a sense, I guess they were the Bible's first vegans. But they were there, and they had a good, healthy habit. And they said, we want to keep this habit. We understand that we can have all this food from the king's table. And the others were probably quite happy to enjoy this perk of their condition. But they said, no, we don't want that. We want to be healthy. We need to be healthy. We need to look after ourselves. And they even said, put us to the test and see if we are not better. And they got put to the test. And they were shown to be much better than the others. And so they were able to continue their diet. So if we want to get into leadership, or if we are in leadership, we do have to have healthy habits. And then finally, God gave Daniel a team. There were four like-minded Jewish youths. And quite often we think it's lonely at the top. But it's not as lonely as most leaders experience. Most leaders need to have a good team around them. And Daniel had a good team around him. He had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were able to support each other, hold each other accountable, and even pray together when the times demanded it. And he was able to ask them for advice and prayer in difficult situations. And during his career with Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel never forgot his three companions. So then the question I ask then, secondly, is where did God place Daniel? Daniel was placed in a non-godly center of power. Daniel was in public service, which comes with its own unique challenges, but also applies to large corporate executive offices as well, and perhaps even leading internationally or leading a country in a denomination or in a religion. Because what happens is when you come into this environment, you find out, first of all, that they have a different mission from you. They have different objectives and values. And although most corporations and even in government would claim themselves to be ethical or at least law-abiding, these four lone Jews were in a foreign kingdom. And they had the challenge of working where other cultures prevailed. So there's a different language, there was a different diet, they didn't even have family there. And finally, they encountered a different history. So first of all, they were in this non-godly center of power, which was quite different from what they had been brought to know. Then how did God use him? He also gave Daniel a career path. Daniel was only one of many administrators to begin with. Until Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, none of the regular set of advisors could either describe or even translate. And as a result, Nebuchadnezzar got so angry and so overpowered by this dream, he said, kill them all. Well, Daniel heard about this, and he went to Nebuchadnezzar and says, hang on, just for a little while. I'd like to have a go at this, please, and just don't do anything until I have a chance to look at it. So Nebuchadnezzar says, well, if you explain my dream to me, and if you tell me what it means, okay, you'll be all right, and everybody will be let go. So Daniel asked his companions to have a prayer time, and they prayed that God would give Daniel the meaning of this dream. In fact, would even explain the dream to him and tell him what it was. They wanted to receive a word from God about the dream. And so God gave Daniel the dream, and he gave him also what it meant. And Daniel was able to go to Nebuchadnezzar and explain it to him and translate what it meant. So the successful description of this dream and its interpretation earned Daniel his spectacular promotion to the governor of the city of Babylon. Here was this Jew in Babylon, now suddenly the governor of the most important city. And this put Nebuchadnezzar's spotlight on him. Now, this is the result of what we would even term a biblical principle. Jesus said in one of his parables, he ended up by saying, well done, my good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many. So when we look at all these professionals, teachers, nurses, doctors, medical professions, first responders, social workers, that when we look at these people doing their work at the coalface, if they're doing a good job, sometimes they will be promoted. Sometimes they will be noticed and picked up and said, we want you to do this and we want you to do that. And eventually, good people can find themselves in positions of authority. At the same time, Daniel successfully requested appointments for the 3 Hebrew companions, which was granted. So the interpretation of the dream was Daniel's start in significant public service, which then makes us ask, how did God use Daniel? In his professional capacity, Daniel was used by God as an influence. Now, don't forget, we have this group of people who are used to power, who are used to authority. But in this environment, God made Daniel also, he didn't take that away from him. He still had power and authority, but he also made him an influence. He used his competence, his intelligence, and his trustworthiness. Paul reminds us, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So Daniel had been provided by God these gifts to use for his purpose in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. When God gives you a talent, when he gives you a gift, he has a purpose in mind, not just for your own edification, not just to have a good job and make good money, but he gave you that good purpose so that you could accomplish his works that he had intended for you to do. He also helped him by giving him access to the king's decision-making process. And within this, he also carried the respect of others. Among the advisors would be military strategists, economic and legal advisors. Similarly, Daniel's primary job was to represent his portfolio, but also his moral and ethical influence provided an extra dimension which made him valuable when the king needed to hear a word from the Lord. When we were in Zimbabwe, we accompanied General Larson when he was given an audience during the All Africa Congress to have an audience with President Robert Mugabe. And when the general sat down with President Mugabe said, I'd like to thank you and the Salvation Army for your involvement in schools, in the education system. Zimbabwe has many schools, very much like Newfoundland was about 60, 75 years ago, when they had these schools and children attended the schools, and they were grateful to the Salvation Army for the education that they received. And the Salvation Army had been involved in schools for many, many years. In fact, in Zimbabwe, they have 5 boarding schools, each of them averaging about 500 students who come there and stay. And this is part of their own development, a marvelous opportunity, really, for the Salvation Army. But he said he's grateful for the Salvation Army's involvement in education. He said, we've had cabinet ministers, we've had economic leaders who have gotten their primary education and their high school education by going to a Salvation Army high school. He said, I'd like to thank you about that. He said, because when we took over from the British, at independence, he said, we took over all the public school systems. And when we did that, we got rid of religion in the schools. We didn't think that was necessary. And so now he says we have great economists, we have great business people, we have great medical professions, but they don't have an ethical or a moral framework in which to work. And so he recognized that the schools that the Salvation Army and other churches were running were at least giving a group of people an ethical and a moral framework in which to work. And it also gave them an opportunity to bring to their organization a word from the Lord. And so he was there already in the boardroom, and his advice and his word from the Lord would have the respect of the people who he worked with. I know that the Elijahs of the world, the Jeremiahs or the John the Baptist, they have their youths. but they would never be welcome in a board meeting or in a boardroom. But Daniel was already there, placed by God. And God was also able to use Daniel because of his rock-solid faith and his relationship with God. You all know the incident of Daniel in the lion's den. It all took place because the members of the court who were hostile to Daniel knew of his daily prayer practice and tried to use that to bring him down. God also provided Daniel with visions and interpretations of dreams and caused him to write his own history. He also included the incident of the 3 companions tied up and thrown into the fiery furnace when they did not honor Baal or participate in the ceremony of adoration for the idol that had been erected by Nebuchadnezzar. The Bible tells us that the men were thrown into this very hot fire, tied up with the clothes on, and even more, and they survived. In fact, the people who were around the fire witnessed not the 3 people, but 4 people walking through the fire, almost as if they were talking with each other. And when they came out, the Bible says, their clothes were not harmed. In fact, they didn't even smell of the smoke. And sometimes when Christians get involved in politics, in corporate life, sometimes they can end up smelling of the smoke of that corporation or the politics. But the promise here and the blessing here was that they didn't even smell of the smoke. So Daniel was able to immortalize his companions forever by including that story in his history. And God also gave Daniel insights. He gave him the gift of prophecy that helped him interpret dreams and also to see into the future. He was able to respond to requests for advice or interpretation of dreams. Daniel was not afraid to bring bad news. In fact, the first bad news he brought to King Nebuchadnezzar was that he was going to have a psychotic episode for 7 years. He said, you would rule for 40 years, but during that time, the 7 years, you're going to be living like an animal out in the fields. And this proved to be true. But then eventually he was restored and was able to take back over his kingdom. Whatever God revealed, Daniel knew that this would be truth, and it gave him confidence to tell the others. You know, I personally experienced what it is like when God gives a special insight regarding a responsibility. I don't know if anybody has ever been to the Grace Hospital that used to be in St. John's, Newfoundland. Well, for 5 years, I had the blessing of being the CEO of that hospital. And the first year I was there, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was almost like a holiday, getting to know the hospital, getting to know the system, the people, and getting to know where things needed to head into. But after I was there for a year, government made a sudden announcement that they were going to accept the commission report that had been written about 5 years before. They were going to close down the Grace Hospital in 6 months. Now, intuitively, I suspected it would not be able to be done. It wouldn't be possible. But our people needed a realistic hope, and the organization needed to rebuild its momentum from this terrible announcement. God sent along events and opportunities that we could not have planned ourselves that reassured us as leaders of the hospital that God still had a plan for his hospital, and it started to give us momentum. But still, as a CEO, I would come home at night and I would be scratching my head trying to think, what can I do? And every time I got involved in a conversation or in an interview, I would talk about the Grace Hospital and talk it up and talk very positively about it. Well, I used every waking thought and action in an effort to strengthen the position of the Grace Hospital. But then I went to ICO for a short period, for 10 weeks. And I didn't really feel I could afford the time, but God gave me this opportunity and said, okay, I will use this opportunity to pray about the Grace Hospital and its future. Well, I did. And while I was praying, God actually made me realize that actually, I don't have to worry about the Grace anymore. That when I go back, the whole system is going to face a problem, and the Grace is actually going to be able to help. So I thought, well, what a relief that was, because every moment I was thinking about the Grace Hospital. Now my mind was able to expand and start thinking about how could the Grace help in a time of provincial trouble. 4 months after I got back, the government suddenly realized there was no more cod in the ocean, and they declared a moratorium on fishing. And for the next 30 years, there was no fishing going on in Newfoundland because the cod was all gone. And the government came to the Grace Hospital and came to the other adult teaching hospitals and said, what can you do to help? Well, because God had given me this warning, I came back and I told the board about this. I said, like, God definitely told me that we don't have to worry about the Grace anymore, that we have to be thinking about how can we help the system. And when government asked us, we were all ready and prepared because God had given us that particular bit of word. So when we are his people working in these kind of places, God is able to use us to send messages to where we are working. So it gives our own place, it gives politics, it gives the corporation an added dimension when there's somebody that they respect who is also a person of God. Daniel survived Nebuchadnezzar and Darius, and the Bible tells us he was still serving and a friend of Cyrus when he gave Nehemiah and Ezra permission to rebuild the temple. So you could see Daniel's influence extended for over 40, 50 years. In fact, he was probably about 80 years old when he finally passed away. But we can see him being part of the restoration of Israel. Right at the end of his life, he saw a prophecy of great impending battle which troubled him. But an angel said to him, do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I came in response to them. That's Daniel 10 and 12. And then Michael, the Archangel Michael, started to explain to him what was going to happen. And so when we look at Daniel and we look at Revelation, these are 2 books of the apocalypse that tell about the ending of time. And a great deal of discussion and conjecture has come as a result of those 2 books. Now, I'm not going to spend any time at all talking about last things, although that was an important part of Daniel's book. Because in truth, when it comes to last things, I'm more of a first things first kind of person. But I repeat what God said. He said, set your mind to understanding, humble yourself before God, and you will hear from God, the good news as well as the bad. So Daniel was a hero in high places. He was remembered by the writer to the book of Hebrews. He said, what more shall I say? I do not have time to talk about Gideon or Barak or Samson and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions. This is the God that we work for, the God who helps us through their faith to conquer kingdoms. What kingdom in your life needs conquering? To administer justice and gain what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions. So wherever we find ourselves, God is there as our protector, so we do not have to fear.